much more democratic input.
My Lord, my Baroness Alton provided in granular detail an analysis of this bill, and we've heard remarkable speeches, particularly from members of your Lordship's House from Northern Ireland, from all sides. And we've heard, and we'll hear others as well, who've held high office in Northern Ireland. And my noble and Reverend friend, Right Reverend friend, Lord Eames, said earlier that he also was glad that there were some coming to the debate who are not from Northern Ireland. And we've just heard from the noble Baroness Lady Bennet, and before that from the noble Baroness Lady Lister. And now the House will, I hope, listen to a few words from me. I, for the best part of 2 decades, represented a constituency in the city of Liverpool, which some wags sometimes refer to as the other capital of Ireland. In Liverpool, my lords, we have a history of sectarianism, but we also have, in recent times, a different story to tell of reconciliation. And indeed, my friend, the sculptor Stephen Broadbent, made a remarkable statue called the Reconciliation Statue, and 2 more, one in the city of Glasgow and one in the city of Belfast. Why did we do that? It was to explain something of the tarnished divisions that had disfigured the story of ours and other people's cities. It was an attempt to understand one another's stories, to stand in each other's shoes. But my own interest in British-Irish affairs, I suppose, really has its antecedents in my own origins, as is the case with thousands and thousands of people who live on this side of the Irish Sea. My father was one of 5 brothers who served in the armed forces in the Second World War. One was in the Royal Air Force and was killed. My grandfather served in the First World War, but my mother was from a Gaeltacht, Irish-speaking area in the west of Ireland. It was her first language. And so growing up in a family that had to live across the religious divide and across different traditions, I suppose I had some experience of the way in which it would take several decades for the old prejudices of the early 1950s to dissipate. The need for reconciliation was something I also saw throughout my years as a city councillor and as a member of Parliament for the city of Liverpool, where sectarianism was still part of its politics. My lords, it took patience, it took time, it took commitment to make progress. Some called it the Mersey miracle. In the 1980s, as Irish Affairs spokesman in the House of Commons for the Liberal SDP Alliance, I worked on the Alliance report, What Future Northern Ireland? I did so with the late Shirley, Baroness Williams of Crosby, and the late Lords Donaldson of Kingsbridge, and the conqueror of Everest, Lord Hunt of Landfair Waterdene. And we travelled together to Northern Ireland in the course of preparing that report. In our report in 1985, we were unanimous in trenchantly advancing the arguments for devolution and power sharing. And that's the issue I most want to talk about during my brief intervention tonight. In a leading article in 1985, the Irish Times said this about the report. They said it was one of the most important documents published on the Anglo-Irish question in recent years. It shows signs of hard work, rigorous thinking, and a commendable attempt at objective analysis. The report set out in detail how power sharing could work and was forthright in defence of civil rights and the rule of law, including the conduct of justice. We published that report believing that power sharing and devolution were the only way in which we could ensure that the hopes, the fears and aspirations of both parts of the community could be met. Short-circuiting devolution and power sharing by pushing on with yet another Westminster bill is simply disempowering of devolution. It's emasculating of power sharing. It's disrespectful of opinion in Northern Ireland and those that they represent, and most especially the victims who should be at the heart of this bill. So I strongly believe that there should be no committee stage of this bill until the Assembly in Northern Ireland is restored, until it has first considered this bill, providing for the pause that my Right Reverend and noble friend Lord Eames mentioned in his remarks earlier on. My Lords, bypassing Northern Ireland doesn't represent progress. It's retrograde and unwise and fundamentally diminishes the principle of devolution. In introducing the bill today, Lord Kane, in his candid, measured and very honest remarks, said you can't force through reconciliation via legislation. But that, my lords, is exactly what I think we are in danger of being asked to do. It's why the Victims Commissioner has asked us to reject these proposals, and it's not just the use of the word reconciliation. Even the words Northern Ireland are inadequate and insufficient. They don't recognise the nature and extent of what is also euphemistically called the Troubles in its title. God knows, my lords, that at its worst, the hatred and the violence that we've been recalling today disfigured and maimed and caused extraordinary suffering and anguish throughout these islands. 3,720 people were killed as a result of the conflict. 47,541 were injured. There were 36,923 shootings, 16,209 bombings. Who will ever forget Bloody Sunday in 1972 or the Enniskillen Poppy Day massacre in 1987? And as the noble Lord Dodds rightly reminded us earlier on, there are still those who glorify in violence and glorify in those who perpetrate it. Yes, the bill is entitled the Northern Ireland Bill, yet its ramifications and the consequences of 3 decades of unspeakable violence have been felt by individuals, families, communities way beyond Northern Ireland. Recall the deaths, my lords, the injuries and millions of pounds worth of damage in 1996 at Canary Wharf and in the Manchester shopping precinct, or the Provisional Irish Republican Army's attempt in 1984 to murder the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and members of her cabinet at the Grand Hotel in Brighton. 5 were left dead and 31 injured. Among them, of course, our noble friend Lord Tebbit and his wife Margaret, who was left paralysed from the chest down. I'm privileged to share an office with the noble Lord Kilcooley, who's been here for most of this debate today, and of course an attempt was made on his life too in 1972. The noble Lord Kane referred to the death of Ian Gow, with whom I served, of course, in another place. But, my lords, in 1979, just 24 hours after I was elected to the House of Commons for that Liverpool division, Erin Neave, the shadow spokesman for Northern Ireland, was murdered here within these precincts when a bomb was fixed underneath his car by the INLA. In my maiden speeches in both houses, I reflected on the futility and the unacceptability of such violence, and I was able also to point to long and ultimately successful attempts in Liverpool to lay to rest sectarian ghosts and to learn the art of respecting difference. It was why, on taking up my responsibilities as a spokesman, I spent a lot of time with Northern Ireland MPs, whom I enormously admire for their commitment to finding non-violent ways forward. And I echo something that the noble Lord Cormac referred to earlier on when he referred to his visit to Crossmaglen. It was a place I visited with Seamus Mallon, who was the SDLP MP, of course, for Newry and Armagh, and who played such an important part with John Hume and with David Trimble in bringing about the Good Friday Agreement. A defining moment for me, my lords, and I suspect for John Major when he was Prime Minister, came in February 1993 when we both attended the funeral of the boys murdered in Warrington after the Provisional IRA left bombs in the High Street. 54 were injured, and a 13-year-old and a 12-year-old boy, Jonathan Ball and Tim Parry, were killed. Out of that tragedy, Tim's father created a peace initiative to promote greater understanding amongst all communities affected by conflict and to deepen understanding between Great Britain and Ireland. Out of it also came new initiatives from Sir John Major and on which Tony Blair was able to build after 1997. Not all of us will be able to find it in our hearts to seek reconciliation, or, like Gordon Wilson, to offer forgiveness in the aftermath of the murder of his daughter at Enniskillen, or, for that matter, in 2011, the way in which Her late Majesty set aside the 1979 murder of the Duke of Edinburgh's uncle, Lord Mountbatten, to seek with President Mary McAleese a different context for our future relationships. No Act of Parliament could have legislated for that, and no Act of Parliament will ever be able to legislate for reconciliation or forgiveness, which is why I believe that issues such as those contained in this bill should first be debated in Northern Ireland and its elected representatives, given the first say in what should happen next. It's simply not good enough for Westminster to emasculate devolution, as it's inclined to do, or by taking to itself decisions which were intended to be settled by Stormont. My lords, the continuation of that process will destroy devolution, not expedite its restoration. And as the noble Baroness Lady Ritchie of Downpatrick said, we need to tread with great care and re-engage the institutions of Northern Ireland. I've just got one more thing to add. If this bill goes further here, I think many of us in the House will be forced to table amendments and to effectively oppose it. I don't think that's in anybody's interest at this time. I recall the way in which leaders from across both parties in both houses worked with one another in order to bring about the Good Friday Agreement. I think this is a moment to stop and to exercise some wisdom rather than to try and rush pell-mell with legislation that, as we have heard in your Lordship's House today, is resisted by people right across the divide. It may be, as the noble Lord Bew said before, that this is not something about which the detail is agreed, the reasons why people are opposed to it, but they are opposed to it. And we had to work with the grain. And that, I think, requires us to endeavour to work with those in Northern Ireland by giving them the first say and working for the restoration of the institutions there before pressing on with this legislation.
My Lords, 2 or 3 times a year I